Mohamed Somji, thank you for speaking to us. You're originally from Tanzania. You were born there. You live in Dubai.
That's right.
And 6 years ago, you entered the BredaPhoto Festival as a photographer.
That's right.
Can you tell me how the process went that you're now a curator here?
Sure. So in 2016, I presented a work called Substations, which were these photographs of diesel stations that don't exist anymore in Dubai. And it was a joint project with Sinisha. And I really enjoyed the festival. I really enjoyed meeting the artists, the curators at the time. And it was a festival that I felt that, deserved more attention because of the kind of work they were showing. I did make a comment that the festival was very, very Eurocentric, and that there was a whole world out there that perhaps they were missing out on. And I think the organizers, the curators, and the director at the time, were quite. They thought about that a lot, and they reached out to me and said, "Hey, we were thinking a lot about what you said, and we really want to open our horizons." And I think we have to give them credit for that, because there was this willingness to look beyond what was really kind of familiar to them.
Yeah. And you put some people from Africa in the selection then?
So I don't think it was as simple as, okay, bring in somebody from Africa and show work. I think they invited not just myself, but Azu, who was a curator from Nigeria, and Yumi Goto from Japan. And I think we collectively worked on let's say, the international selection at the time. And I think fast forward to 2022, that has changed a lot in that we have worked very closely as a team. I don't think it was a question of like, oh, I brought in this photographer. Yes, I had contact with them. I presented that work, but we had a very kind of collective discussion. And it's been really interesting to see that there were some people that I proposed that others didn't like. And I was like, okay, you make a good point. And instead, let me present somebody else. And, I was also able to give feedback about other projects that I felt that perhaps were not very fitting for the theme, or that there was better work,
Can you give me an example of somebody you've created that fitted the theme?
Absolutely. So I would say Tanya Habjuka is a really, really good example. Tanya showed work in the last edition in 2020 in a project called the Sacred Space Oddity. And this year, I think her project is a very, very good microcosm of this idea of theater of dreams. Tanya lives in Palestine, and she is documenting work that is, the project is called We Are Children of 9 Months. And she is looking at this phenomena where almost 100 children have been born when couples in Palestine have smuggled the sperm of the prisoners to their wives, and they've had babies that have come up, and they've smuggled them through candy wrappers or lighter fluid and things like that. And I think that is a beautiful example of how people are fighting the oppressive conditions around them to live, to love, and to, try and...
To lead a normal life.
To lead a normal life. And I also love her project because she has collaborated with the Center for Fertility, where they are facilitating this. So you can really see a good example of how there's resistance to oppression. How also her work is not very documentary in style, that there is a lot of like interpretive and beautiful kind of lyrical portraits. So I think they come together in a very successful way. And, the other example is, Hind Medeb, who's a filmmaker, and she documented the Sudanese revolution that happened. And the driving force was young people in Sudan who were creatives and poets and artists and photographers. And they came together to be part of this major movement that toppled the regime of the President Bashir at the time. And of course, they are still facing a lot of challenges and difficulties. But, she documented this very kind of this energy to show that this was possible, that people are saying enough is enough, right? And hers is a film, and you can see some very kind of beautiful and complex testimony from these people. So I think that there are lots of examples, not only the two that I mentioned, that look at the mystical. Like Kevin Osepa's work is really beautiful and spiritual and mystical. You have the work of Mark Ockleff, for example, which is showing a simple thing like touch and intimacy between humans.
In India.
In India, and it's not there's some aspects of sexuality, but it's just also how cis male people just are intimate in touch, and in the West it would be considered something that is very strange, but in our part of the world there's a very kind of beautiful tenderness behind it. So yeah, exactly. And
Nope.
so there are so I think the festival is really diverse in its way of presenting this idea of theater of dreams, looking at very kind of documentary projects, but also looking at some very kind of, the future of the Dutch cow, for example, by Hans van der Meer, is a great example of how photographers are looking at ways to rethink how agriculture is done, And I think, especially at the stage of my life, that it's more important to unlearn than to learn. And I think some of these projects help you ask the questions about how we've been thinking about things in the same way, and perhaps unlearning is quite valuable. So,
and also the fact that we, as human beings, are the only ones who can change the world for ourselves.
Absolutely, and it goes back to that quote that I mentioned about hope is really the only thing we have. I mean, we must have hope that things can be better, and sometimes it can feel like it's impossible. But what else do we have if we don't have hope?
Yeah. Hope is the only thing we have to reach a state of grace.
Absolutely, absolutely.
You're a gallery owner yourself in Dubai. Are there some differences that come to mind if you see the Dutch infrastructure in photography and your infrastructure that you're used to? What are those differences?
Sure. Well, I think in Holland, there is a lot of maturity around the photography scene. In the UAE and in the Middle East, where we work, it's still relatively new. I mean, if you think about it, Saudi Arabia, the biggest country in the Middle East in terms of population and geography, photography was forbidden until 2006. So it's still very, very new, right? And I think it's been a medium, because it's so accessible, that is being used in very interesting and subversive ways to document social injustices, to kind of make people aware about things, and to really kind of challenge some of these status quo. So I think, and because of this, environment or this condition that we have, photographers have become really smart with how they're using the medium to do really challenging and difficult things, which you have to read between the lines, right?
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah. So let's say there are photographers who talk about queerness and sexuality in the region, but the photographs that they use would not be similar to what you would see in Europe, for example. They would not be nudity, and they would be a lot more subtle. There would be a lot more kind of cultural clues that are relevant to the societies themselves that the audience would understand. And I think there are other ways where photographers are using mediums outside of photography to tell their stories, complementing their photography. So the exhibition that we're showing right now, for example, that just went down in our gallery in Dubai, was called Swallow This: Arab Women and Body Politics. So, we used a lot of kind of figurative or very kind of interpretive images to talk about the idea of hymen rebuilding, for example, for women who want to hide that they've had sex before marriage. So I think the artists in the region are very adept at finding ways to tell their stories without getting into trouble in very kind of subtle ways. And I think the audiences are starting to respond to that. And it's still quite new, and there's this real energy around photography. And I think what we try to focus on is that it doesn't have to be photography per se. It's about storytelling. And if you use some images along with voice, mapping, texts, oral testimonies, performance, so be it. And I really think that we are seeing some really interesting photography and storytelling from not just the Middle East, but from Africa and from Asia. And in a way, I think it's even more innovative than what I see in Europe and North America. And that's exciting for me.
Yeah. So it's more geographically diverse, the things that you brought in, and conceptually diverse too. One of the other things you were talking about is that collaboration is very important. Is it also a way to mitigate the risk?
Yeah, I think mitigate the risk and also to kind of bring some credibility to making your project. Now, I'm not saying that individual photographers can't go out and make work that is honest, authentic, fair, and revelatory. I think you can, but I think working with the communities that you are photographing makes it much more richer, makes it more complex, and makes it more nuanced. And it also allows for different perspectives. And I think we have to stop this idea of like photographers working in silos. Like I think I have seen examples of when photographers collaborate with academics, with farmers, or with environmentalists if they're working on an environmental project. It brings a whole new world to both those parties. The environmentalist is able to articulate through photography what they are trying to do with their work, and the photographers now have some substance to build their work on. It is so much more, richer and, much more solid in a way.
Yeah. What's the ideal result of your efforts here on the as curator on this festival?
I tend to discount this idea that photography changes the world. I think that that's a very lofty goal, but I think if it makes people stop and kind of think about things in a different way, perhaps, or even what I'm excited about is coming to Breda. I know that the work that we're showing is far from being Eurocentric, and there's a lot of perspectives around the world. I hope that it kind of challenges some, perceptions that people have. Like there is this beautiful work by Nida Mehboob, a video on like sexuality, very kind of sex positive story of women in Pakistan, which is something that if you ask your typical Dutch person would never have, perceived some women in Pakistan being that sex positive, for example. So I think the hope is that people see these things, see these projects, and maybe unlearn some things that they thought that they knew, and that would be a great start.
And showing a lot more perspectives to European audience. Mohamed Somji, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.